So it's really, it's been fun as we plan these conferences to figure out who would be a great guest to have to talk to over dinner. And I decided that, you know, well, last year you were preceded by the mayor of Atlanta, who had a somewhat different economic situation than you did. But I decided that there wasn't really any other politician in America who could explain to us exactly how was it that you came to sing your song on Dawson's Creek. And I want you to know that I had originally proposed that we were going to play for that album, but I got vetoed by my staff. So I just want to apologize that in advance. So tell us a little bit about how you came to be. Tell us about your musical career before we get to all the good stuff about credit ratings.
My musical career was very, very brief. And you just described the complete career. So I used plan A was to play music. It was I used to play country rock, and I had recorded some songs down in Austin after college. And if you ever watched or had kids who watched the show Dawson's Creek, they always featured some independent music. And so I got one of my songs, 30 seconds of one of my songs played on Dawson's Creek on one episode. And, you know, I will never, I will probably never top it and never live it down.
But then there was an album issued in 2012 or 13.
No, it actually was 2001. That was the same, that was from the same period, recording it right after college.
So are you getting royalty checks or not yet?
Occasionally, no. Actually, they bought me out. They bought that song out. Yeah.
And that's how you finance the municipal.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't know how many people. Luke Bronin has had an extraordinary career. I kind of wonder, like, what are you going to do in the next 39 years? He's originally from Westchester County. He grew up some in Greenwich, Connecticut. He went to Yale College and Yale Law School. Both he and his wife were Rhodes Scholars. They got a really cool wedding, one of those vows things in the New York Times when they got married. He was in the U.S. Naval Reserve and served as a naval intelligence officer in Afghanistan. He worked in the Obama Treasury, in terrorist finance, among other things. And then he was a general counsel to the governor of Connecticut. So if anybody wants to talk about that, I'm going to start with what followed that. I mean, I know it might sound like a lifetime's worth of work, but after that, he decided it hadn't been challenging enough, and he decided to run for mayor of Hartford. So I wonder if you could start by telling us a little bit about why you decided to run for mayor of Hartford and what you discovered when you had the pleasure or pain of winning.
Well, Hartford's a great town. I mean, Sarah and I moved up there in 2006, and we moved there both because she teaches at UConn Law School, which brought us up, and because, you know, we saw in Hartford the sort of perfect balance of, you know, a city that's got incredible arts and cultural institutions, beautiful parks, beautiful historic buildings, and you know, a lot of things to do, so enough things to do that it was, you know, like a city, but small enough that you could really be part of the fabric of a community in a meaningful way, which was important to both of us. And so, you know, we decided to live right in the heart of downtown Hartford at a time when there are not a lot of people living in downtown, and we just fell in love with it. And although we were gone for 4 years in the Obama administration, we, you know, always planned to come back. Had the chance to come back, as you said, and work for the governor for a couple of years, and, you know, Hartford is a city that has, over the last few decades, periodically been on the verge of, you know, what felt like something special. There's a sense of energy and momentum, and I think there was I had that same sense that this could be a moment, as you saw, you know, small urban communities around the country get a new infusion of energy and young people and talent, that this could be an important moment. But I was also really frustrated with a lot of decisions that I saw being made in the city of Hartford. Either just short-sighted decisions or bad decisions, you know, irresponsible decisions, and what also felt like just a lack of vision or urgency to try to seize this moment that small cities around the country were seizing. And so decided to make a run, and most people didn't think that it was a winnable race, but won it, and I love the job. We've certainly had our battles over the past couple of years, but there really is at this point just a new sense of energy and activity in the city that I think has been missing for a while.
What did you know about Hartford finances when you ran, and what did you learn after you got to look at the books?
Like a lot of Connecticut cities and like a lot of New England cities in general, there were some structural problems that were apparent from the start. Hartford is too small to begin with. You have a city that's 17 square miles. You have an intense concentration of poverty. This past year, the fourth poorest community in the country. You have cities that have far greater needs than the suburbs that surround them, but about the same amount of taxable property. So you have, in most of our cities, and Hartford in particular, half of the property in the city is non-taxable, and property tax is the only real source of locally generated revenue. So I knew we had those deep structural problems. I knew that the city, had to cut for a while, and I knew that the city had done what I think were some irresponsible, short-sighted refundings that left us with a rapidly escalating debt service. So I knew we were going to have some big gaps to close in the years ahead. What I didn't fully appreciate when I took office was just how deep in the hole we were that very first year. That the budgeting had really relied on inaccurate assumptions about both revenues and expenditures and one-time revenues to a very large extent. And so, we were in the hole from day one and looking at yawning gaps that we were going to have to close. And, you have a city that, look, in most situations, you have two levers to pull for fiscal, public fiscal management, either revenues or expenses. Revenue was not an option in the immediate term because we've got a mill rate of 74.29. What that means is that our commercial property is paying 5% of the value of their property every single year. That's madness. And we should have drawn the line about a decade and a half before and said we can't raise this any further without doing long-term damage to the city. So I drew that line then and said I will not under any circumstances raise this mill rate. We did cut costs. We made some deep cuts to cost, but it was apparent from pretty early on that you could not possibly responsibly cut enough to close the gaps that we faced. And so how well do you think the credit rating agencies had understood what you discovered when you became the mayor? It's a great question, and it's something that has puzzled me. I don't know if we have representatives from rating agencies here. I assume we probably do. They can leave the room now. Look, I think that the depth of Hartford's problem should have been apparent a number of years before. And yet, Hartford was in 2015, the year before I took office, rated single A or double A credit. And I don't think that was justified at the time. I think Hartford's fundamentals were far weaker than that. And the downgrades didn't start coming until I started talking about the problem. And I mean, it is funny in a sense, but it's also a problem because I think that it's one of the things that kept my predecessors and maybe keeps other mayors around the country from talking about problems that need to be talked about. Everyone's afraid of a downgrade because of what that, how that reflects on you as a leader or your city as a city. But if you're not able to talk about those problems in an honest way, there's no way you can solve them. What's frustrating in a little bit is that I felt that the rating agencies were lagging, and that they probably should have seen that problem coming long before. I mentioned, some refundings that were done. In 2013 and 2015, there were a couple of transactions that were done that really were classic scoop and toss, coupled with some new issuance that was not supportable or sustainable. And as a result, you had a debt service. When I took office, the fiscal year 16, ending June 30th of 16, we had a debt service of $10 million, down from $30 million a couple years before. But without any new borrowing, that rose to $56 million by fiscal year 2021. it's just crazy and not surmountable in a responsible way. So I don't know how rating agencies didn't send up flares when those transactions were being contemplated. And it certainly was frustrating that the downgrades came when, as I saw it, we finally had a city administration that was willing to acknowledge and tackle tough problems in a serious way.
Did people really tell you don't be so honest? 'Cause it's gonna...
Absolutely. Lots of people. And to be fair, I mean, they had a point. Right. we dropped to a CCC, and CA3, I think. So, we took some pretty big hits. But my view was that, we were over the cliff with our legs still running, and there was no point in pretending that wasn't true.
So walk us through a little bit the progression. You discover you have this insurmountable debt service. There's some consideration of bankruptcy. Just tell us a little bit about how that unfolded. I'm not sure everybody knows the outcome, but I'm not sure everybody knows the journey.
Well, in that first fiscal year, that first 6 months, the first step was acknowledging and talking about the depth of the crisis and trying to bring people along, at least in understanding, where we stood. And that was a challenge in itself. I think there were a lot of people, whether it was our residents or our labor unions or state legislators or others who didn't believe that the crisis was as big as it was. They thought that either we were inflating, the numbers to make it look worse, or that we didn't really know what we were talking about, or that there must have been some money hidden under some couch cushion somewhere. And it took, I would say, a good year or more for the reality to really set in. And I spent a lot of time building awareness, both locally and around the region. I did, town hall tours of all the towns in the greater Hartford region, in some cases some pretty hostile audiences, just to talk about the fact that, look, if you want your capital city to be strong, then we've got to build a new partnership because the model we've got doesn't work.
And did the suburban towns kick in ever? No.
Not directly. I mean, ultimately, as you know, what happened is the state, we built as I call it, we built a new partnership with the state of Connecticut, accountability mechanism coupled with debt relief. But to go back to your question, that was sort of the first stage. And we dealt with those early budgets by making some very deep cuts, by pushing our labor unions for some very significant concessions, by getting a conditional commitment from 3 of our big employers, our 3 big insurance companies, that they would put in some money as part of a comprehensive solution, but that money didn't actually come, to the table until just about 2 weeks ago. And then we just kept beating the drum and saying, there are 3 possibilities here. One is that we file bankruptcy. 2 is that we build this new partnership with the state that actually makes it possible to run the city in a, deliver basic level of services and project stability for, the foreseeable future. Or 3, we cut so deep that you cease to be able to function as a city, you cease to deliver services, and maybe the legislature gives you a year-by-year lifeline where you're in a permanent state of crisis and a permanent state of uncertainty. And what I said to the legislature and to the state as a whole was, look, tell us if you want us to go option 1, we'll go option 1. We'll file. We're going to do the work, very serious work of preparing for bankruptcy filing, if that's the route we have to go, or build a new partnership. But whatever you do, please don't choose option 3 and give us a 1-year lifeline and keep us out of bankruptcy for a year, but have that sword constantly hang over our head, because then we surrender any ability to actually get the city on a path to growth and to strength. And ultimately, after a long delayed state budget process where it seemed increasingly like we would file, the state decided to choose the path of building that new partnership.
So let's stick with the bankruptcy. So what did you learn about the pros and cons of Chapter 9 in your investigation?
So what I said in a letter that I sent to the legislative leaders and to the governor was, there are those who say that bankruptcy is the only answer, and they are wrong. And there are those who say that bankruptcy should be avoided at all costs, and they are also wrong. Bankruptcy is a tool that allows you to deal with some things that you can't otherwise deal with, whether it's the pension obligations or the debt obligation. It obviously allows you to make some changes on the labor side, although we ended up making some very significant changes on the labor side without it. But bankruptcy, for Hartford's situation, bankruptcy itself wouldn't solve the underlying problem, because the underlying problem was still that you had a city built on the tax base of a suburb, and bankruptcy couldn't change that. So my view was that bankruptcy was far better than permanent crisis, but that if we could build the will around the state for a new partnership that, recognize that if you want to grow a state, you've got to have strong and vibrant cities, and that Hartford, in addition to being the symbolic capital of Connecticut, also happens to be its largest center of private employment and largest economic engine. Ultimately, we were able to make that case.
So you make a deal with the state. The state's going to pick up your debt service for some period of time, right? I don't remember exactly how this works.
Well, the way it works, it's an indefinite commitment. The state assumed the obligation for paying all of our currently outstanding debt. That's 20 years out. If the state has the right under this agreement to restructure it as it sees fit, or to direct us to restructure it as it sees fit, so maybe it ends up getting extended beyond that 20 years, and that's at the state's discretion. But the state still provides other sources of revenue. The state still provides education revenue. It still provides some amount of payment in lieu of taxes, although far less than the state formula demands. And so there are other funding that could always be cut. And for those of you who followed Connecticut closely, there was a big debate about whether the legislature really understood that it was assuming this long-term obligation and locking itself in. To a large extent, I think that is that question and that conversation is sort of based on a misunderstanding about what it is. Because if the state chooses to reduce other sources of revenue down the line, it has every ability, every authority to do that. My hope, however, is that having made the decision to go down this path of a new partnership, that the state will stay committed to that new partnership, because I really do think that the economic future of Connecticut depends on creating some stability, creating some energy in our cities, and focusing hard on growth.
But what the state did for you doesn't do much good for New Haven or Bridgeport or Waterbury, so you can understand why they thought this isn't fair to us.
Well, it's not entirely true, because the trade of accountability for debt relief came through a statewide municipal accountability review board, and it's a board that has 4 tiers of oversight. From the bottom, it's really just some reporting obligation, all the way to tier 4, which is essentially a full state takeover of the municipality. We're at tier 3, and contract assistance, which is the mechanism through which the state took on this debt obligation, is available in some form to any tier 3 municipality. There are only 2 cities in the state that have sought to be designated as tier 3, Hartford and West Haven. If Bridgeport and New Haven were to decide to seek designation as a tier 3, then some of those same tools would be available. Now, whether they'd be used in precisely the same way is a different question.
Define what you mean by tier 3. What does that entail for you?
So tier 3, for us, tier 3 means the following. 1, we have to provide monthly financial reports. 2, any contracts over $100,000 are subject to review and comment by the board. 3, the board gets to have an up or down vote on any labor contracts, whether they're achieved through agreement or through arbitration. 4, they get to review, comment, and approve our budget. They don't have line item authority, but they get to approve our budget, and they're really reviewing it for those big things I talked about earlier. Are the revenue assumptions reasonable? Are the expenditures assumptions reasonable? Is there a reliance on one-time revenues? So it's a combination of sort of advisory authority and some real substantive authority. And then, as I said, a Tier 4 is sort of a full takeover with also some additional labor powers.
And how does this make Hartford economically sustainable for the long run?
So this in itself does not, look, what I would say is this. For the first time in probably 25 or 30 years, we can look our residents and our businesses and legislators and the fellow, residents of Connecticut in the eye and say honestly that we see a path to balanced budgets over the next 5 years. We have put forward a 5-year sustainability plan. That's also a requirement of Tier 3. You put forward that long-term sustainability plan, which gets blessed by the Municipal Accountability Review Board. We've put forward that plan. I believe that's an achievable plan. Whether that period of 5 years of stability turns into true long-term sustainability depends on a number of things. One, it depends on maintaining the discipline that we've shown over the last few years. Two, it depends on growth. And that's why we're focusing as aggressively as we can on growth, because again, if property taxes are the local, the only real source of locally generated revenue, we need to attract investment. Now, the positive story here is that at the same time we've been battling this crisis, there actually has been a tremendous amount of interest in Hartford, and as I said at the start, just a different level of energy and activity. You've had a bunch of long vacant and blighted commercial buildings converted to residential communities that have filled up to 98, 99% and stayed there. You've got more feet on the street in the downtown because of that than you've had in decades, and with that come coffee shops and restaurants. You have a minor league ballpark, which although I wouldn't have built it, I wouldn't have chosen to build it. I actually had to get it built, and is now selling out almost every game and bringing a lot of people back into the city to rediscover it. You got a UConn campus now in the downtown that's bringing a few thousand students in. You have a historic hotel, the Goodwin Hotel, has been brought back to life through private investment. And then on the economic development side, non-real estate side, you've got Infosys just announcing that they're going to make Hartford one of 4 innovation hubs in the U.S. You have all of our insurance companies, for the first time ever, partnering together and partnering with the city to launch an InsurTech accelerator and trying to do a lot of the innovation work that they've been doing for many years out in Silicon Valley in Hartford. You got Stanley Black & Decker, which is a Hartford area company, deciding to launch Advanced Manufacturing Center of Excellence and Advanced Manufacturing Accelerator right in the heart of the city. So we're pushing hard to move as fast as we can, both to promote and to attract development, and to get our business community really rallied around the vision of making Hartford a center of growth and innovation.
What have you learned about dealing with public employee unions that has applications outside of Hartford? There's a camera.
You told me this is on the record.
It's on the record and there's a camera.
Look, I think at the end of the day, I really do think that one of the biggest challenges was getting on the same page about the reality that we faced. Once we had gotten that done, and once our unions recognized that this was not a manufactured crisis, this was a real crisis, that the future of the city was at risk, that the future of their commitments that were made to their members was at risk, they came to the table in a real way. And when we ultimately, there are a couple unions we have still not done deals with. So there are a couple of holdouts, but with our police, our firefighters, our public works employees, a lot of our administrative employees, we got deals done that I don't think you could find a town or a city in Connecticut, Republican or Democrat, small town or suburb or city, that got more done in one contract than we got in each of those contracts. And so I give them a lot of credit for, at the end of the day, coming to the table in a meaningful way and selling some pretty tough packages to their members and getting them through.
So I think one of the challenges to any community like yours, so Hartford's about 85% minority, 40% Hispanic, largely Puerto Rican, about a third African American, only about 15% non-Hispanic white. As you mentioned earlier, there's quite a bit of poverty. And I think we've seen here in the district that what often seems as success to people like me, restaurants to go to on 14th Street, condos that go up in value, is seen as just the threat of gentrification to people who've lived here for a long time. So I know that gentrification is a bit of a luxury, that you should be so lucky that you have 14th Street. But I'm just sort of curious how you think about the dynamics of successful mean more upper middle class people moving into downtown Hartford, some of whom will be displacing people who've lived there for a long time.
Well, I think one point that's important to note is that that last piece isn't really true for Hartford, at least not yet, and probably not for a long time. You know, Hartford's downtown was empty. There was virtually no residential, with the exception of one building and a few brownstones, there was no real residential base in downtown Hartford, and that's a significant difference, because when you create a 150 unit apartment building out of what used to be a vacant Bank of America building, you're not displacing anybody. You are creating a more economically diverse community. You are bringing some life and energy back to the downtown, and all those properties have been 80-20 projects, so 80% market, 20% affordable. So even in those properties, there's been some amount of affordable housing built into them. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that we have tried very hard to focus on neighborhood economic development as well as downtown. We have, it's just to give some examples, we've got two very large old post-war public housing projects that were increasingly in disrepair, increasingly vacant, and becoming a real sort of increasing risk to what's sort of the strongest homeowning part of our North End neighborhood, which is our overwhelmingly African American and West Indian neighborhood. Those two projects, we have been able to get those buildings dropped down. One of them is already far along the way in getting rebuilt into modern, affordable housing, mix of home ownership and rental. One of them with a commercial strip along an avenue. There was a federal money that had been sitting unused for about 20 years to redevelop a major corridor through the north end of Hartford as well, and we finally were able to shake that loose and make it move forward, so that for the first time in decades you see some development happening along that corridor. And I could give many other examples, but we have tried hard to make sure that we're not leaving our neighborhoods out. And that we're working hard to show that my vision and sort of the mantra that I use is that our vision is for the city of Hartford to be the strong and vibrant heart of this region of 1 million people, but to be a city where everybody has a share in Hartford's rise. And that's it's easier said than done, but we're trying hard to make it true.
And do you look to Washington at all for help, or you look at them as irrelevant or worse?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not sure either of the first two. I wouldn't say we're looking to Washington for a lot of help right now. We had a very good relationship. I was lucky to have worked in the Obama administration and to have a year of overlap with the Obama administration, and we had a great partnership. We don't see a lot of help coming from the federal government. Although I will say one thing, which is that the Opportunity Zone provision of the tax bill of the budget that was passed last fall, I think really may create some opportunity for us to attract some investment, and so we're going to be working hard to take full advantage of that. So that may be one thing that came out of Washington that could prove to be very beneficial. I think overall, for a community that is as diverse as Hartford is, I think the bigger impact of what's happening in Washington is just the polarization and the divisiveness and the anxiety and the anger and the fear that has a very real impact on the psychology of cities and communities all across the country, and that's it's felt strongly in Hartford.
So just want to ask you one personal question, then we go to the audience. So you flirted with a while for running for governor, and I'm wondering, A, why the hell did you want to do that? And given that you managed to pass some of your problems onto the state budget, and secondly, why did you decide not to do it?
Well, I mean, by running for mayor, I proved that I have at least one screw loose. So,
so you wanted to prove you had a second screw loose and be governor?
I love my job. I love trying to solve problems like this. I feel strongly about the possibilities of Hartford, and I also feel strongly about the possibilities of Connecticut. Connecticut is a great state. I mean, you have tremendous assets, and I think it's going to require some very tough decisions and some long-term planning in Connecticut to get us where we need to go, and it's going to take a while to get there, but I think you can get there with the right leadership. And to me, the key things that we really need to do in Connecticut, aside just disciplined, honest budgeting, is number one, recognize that you cannot grow a state in America today if you don't have strong cities. I mean, you can't attract talent. You can't attract the jobs that are following the talent. You don't have to be a New York or a Boston. There are lots of mid-tier cities around the country that are growing, but you've really got to focus in a deliberate way on growth. And so that's one thing. And two, I think Connecticut has an amazing asset in our location, but we are constrained by our transportation infrastructure. So I think that somebody very soon is going to have to bite the bullet and fight hard to put tolls on Connecticut roads so that we can fund some infrastructure upgrades, a particular focus on rail. And three, there actually is a lot of growth happening in the manufacturing sector. You look at Electric Boat, Pratt & Whitney, and the very large supply chain that they have. There's tens of thousands of jobs being created in manufacturing, but not nearly enough being done on the workforce development side. So to me, the idea of being able to tackle those three things was really exciting to me. I think that's what we have to do as a state. I would have loved to get a chance to do it. Ultimately, I stepped back from it largely because I had to defend what we had gained in Hartford. And there were some attempts to kind of roll back or undo that partnership that we built. And it was hard enough as mayor to defend that ground we gained. It would have been a lot harder if I had still been a candidate. So I decided to step back.
My favorite thing about the latest innovations in transportation in Connecticut is there's now I think it's state finance train from New Haven to Hartford, right?
Yeah.
But the bathrooms are not ADA accessible, so they're locked. Nobody can use them. I will do actually one more. So you and Sarah have 3 kids, right?
We do.
How old are they?
9, 7, and 4.
And Sarah teaches law, and she does some other amazing things. She's both a lawyer and an architect. So how do you manage to have a family and have your kids recognize you, given the kind of job you have?
Well, the great thing about being mayor of a small city is that I work 2 blocks from home, so I don't have to spend a lot of time commuting, and I can kind of pop home at odd hours. I try to we try the best we can to kind of carve out a routine and stick to it. I don't know. I probably don't hold up my end of that as well as I should, but I try to take the mornings and then be home either for a little bit of dinner or for bedtime, and then go out afterwards, or.
Well, where do your kids go to school?
They go to a Montessori school in West Hartford. And
do you have full-time help or
not? Not full-time, but we have some consistent help.
Uh-huh. And does this work? Do you feel like you're? No, I'm serious. No, I mean, look, I don't think there are a lot of role models for people in public life with jobs as demanding as yours, and partners who have demanding jobs who make it work. So I want to hear how you make it work.
I think it does. I think it does work. Look, Sarah she does do a lot of things. Her main job is a law professor, but she does a lot of things beyond that. But she has a fair amount of flexibility in the hours that she sets. Although being mayor is kind of a 24/7 job, I also have the ability to set my schedule a little bit and try to carve out those times. So in some ways, I think we may be luckier than a lot of families. A lot of families either with long commutes or have to do a lot of business travel. That can be an even harder balance to
That's true.
to
But also
strike.
setting your own schedule. All right, there's a couple of mics, and I can't see, so you'll have to stand up, and they'll bring you a mic. And tell us who you are.
My name is Ashton Goodfield. I'm with DWS, and thank you very much for this panel. It was fascinating. I have a question about the stigma of bankruptcy. As investors, we hope that there is a stigma to bankruptcy and that there wouldn't be a rush to needlessly declare bankruptcy. So I'd like to hear your perspective as what you thought about as you considered bankruptcy in terms of your own political career and how declaring bankruptcy might impact that, and also what you thought about the prospects of Hartford borrowing in the municipal market in the future after having declared bankruptcy.
It's a great question, and it's one that we wrestle with a lot. I think with respect to Hartford specifically, I actually think that the reputational harm might have been greater to the state of Connecticut than it would have been to the city of Hartford itself. I think partly because I spoke very loudly and very directly about our challenges. Hartford became, pretty widely known for its fiscal challenges. I'm not actually sure that being in bankruptcy would have made all that much difference to the reputation of Hartford. I think for some, it would have demonstrated that measures were being taken with a view to the long term, and that at the end of the day, the city would be on a more stable footing. For Connecticut, to be the first state in the country to have its capital city actually file and go through a bankruptcy, I think might have been, on top of the fiscal challenges that the state has and some of the reputational challenges that the state has had, I think it in some ways would have been more damaging to the state. But look, I mean, ultimately my view is you have to be clear-eyed about this, and if there's no better option, then you might have to embrace a bad one. And I really do believe what I said in that letter that I quoted earlier. I would have, I think the best outcome is to build a partnership that actually makes it possible to run a city that is built on the tax base of a suburb. But if that hadn't been possible, I think bankruptcy would have been the only other responsible path, and that trying to kick the can or buy some time would not have been wise or responsible. To the question about my political future, I mean, I was never all that sure I was going to get elected to begin with. And if I had ended up only doing one term after tackling and honestly fixing fiscal challenges in Hartford, I would have been fine with that. I guess in the back of my head, I sort of set I kind of said to myself, well, if we're going to go down this road of filing, then maybe I'll make it my goal to see if I can be the first mayor in the country to take a city both into and out of bankruptcy.
Natalie? Can you just wait for the mic because it's hard to hear in here?
So yes, thank you very much. It's a very interesting and important conversation.
And identify yourself.
I am Natalie Cohen. I work for Wells Fargo Securities Municipal Research. So you mentioned workforce development. You are blessed with lots of large corporations in your geography, and there are also lots of kids in your city. How do you make the marriage between the school district and developing those kids so that they can work in some of those large corporations that are already resident there?
It's a great question, probably maybe the biggest challenge that we've gotten, far bigger than the fiscal challenges we were talking about. The vast majority of jobs, held by at those big companies are held by folks who live outside of the city. In part, I know that she thought I couldn't read her lips from up here. So look, I mean, I think there are two things that we are working to do, neither of which is moving fast enough. One, you've got to just strengthen your basic core K through 12 education. Although I will say that when you have such an intense concentration of poverty and such stark socioeconomic segregation, which happens to fall almost perfectly along racial lines, so you also have stark racial segregation. Resulting in schools where in some schools you got more than 60% of the student body is either special needs or English language learners. I think it takes a bigger restructuring of our educational system to deliver those kids the education they deserve. Inside the bounds and with the constraints that we face, we're trying hard to, with a new superintendent to improve the basic teaching and learning at our neighborhood schools. And that's the first step. The second step is trying to build direct partnerships between our schools and those employers, whether that's apprenticeship programs. And there are a couple of apprenticeship programs that have been working pretty well, but it's still at relatively small scale with our community colleges. And I think that's probably the best place to focus. And we're working hard to expand those relationships. There are a couple of good relationships with the insurance companies. And where I think we have a lot of room to build is in the pipeline to those advanced manufacturing jobs that I talked about earlier. So those are the two things that we've got to do.
Do you have the resources?
Well, on that second piece, I don't think it's so much a question of resources as it is a question of aligning the resources you've got. It's a question of making sure that the degrees offered the degrees or certificates offered at your community colleges are actually preparing students for the jobs that are out there, and that the employers are playing a very direct role in identifying what those jobs are and building those curricula and building that pipeline. So I don't know that that's so much a resource question. On the K through 12 question, no, I don't think we do have the resources that we need. Again, I think that what you really need is to take a much bigger look at the structure of your educational system, so that you're not asking teachers to bear the sole burden of what I think should be a broader responsibility of creating more opportunity for young people. When you have such an intense concentration of need, it's a whole different challenge, and we don't have nearly enough resources to do it right.
Dan? And George, yeah. Dan?
But can I say one other thing to go back to?
Yeah, of course.
So this ties a little bit into this question that you asked, but also ties back to something you asked, David, about how do you measure success, and is it an inclusive? Is your growth inclusive? One of the things that Hartford has struggled with is that even when we've been successful at giving folks opportunity, and when young people have worked hard and gotten themselves to college and gotten that job, they tend to move out of the city, because moving out of the city has become a measure of success. And so one of the things that we're working hard to do is to reverse that, and to create a city that is active enough and vibrant enough and interesting enough and diverse enough that when Hartford residents and Hartford's families find that opportunity, that they still decide to keep Hartford their home.
Dan?
Dan Bergstresser at Brandeis University. If you were to take the education that you've gotten in the last couple of years and apply that to the task of being a municipal credit analyst, what would be kind of the key one or two signals that you would look for as a credit analyst to try to figure out when somebody in the situation that you were in 2 years ago had decided they were going to kick the problem down the road?
I don't know that I can tell anybody here anything they don't already know. I mean, I think it was not all that complicated to see what the problem was. So I don't know. I think all those things that everyone's already looking at. Reliance on one-time revenues. Repeatedly falling. Repeatedly ending in deficit. But again, I think it was those two bond transactions that to me were just unforgivable, because the other problems were really just symptoms of that basic structural challenge that I talked so much about tonight. That restructuring, I think, was totally unjustifiable, because the consequences of it were so clear.
George?
George Friedlander, Court Street Group. One FYI before.
I'm sorry, I interrupt you. I thought I want to add one more thing to that. And this gets back a little bit to the conversation, the question that you asked in the back about bankruptcy. What I would say if I were a credit analyst or speaking to a credit analyst is, don't necessarily take it as a positive that a city is going to do everything it can to survive another year. Sometimes that makes it worse. And I think sometimes that the credit analysts look and say, so long as it looks like these guys are really terrified of bankruptcy, then everything's going to be okay because they're going to keep jacking up taxes and we're going to get, and these bonds are going to get paid off. But at the end of the day, if it's that deeply broken, it's not going to change. It's only going to get worse. So I think that's what I would say is, recognize that sometimes shining a bright light on a crisis and calling it out and bringing it to a head can actually be the best possible thing for, long-term stability. And that being afraid to do that may be the worst thing.
George?
Just a quick FYI before I ask my question. My son is finishing up his doctorate in psychology at University of Hartford.
Excellent.
So.
Okay, and are you committing that he'll live in Hartford for the next 5 years, George?
We got some great new apartments.
West Hartford, I'm afraid. I'm big on technological change and how it fits back into cities. And a number of the cities that have been successful of late, from Pittsburgh to Chattanooga to Charleston to Columbus to Atlanta, have done it on some sort of smart city foundation. And one of the advantages that a number of them had was a technological university. And it seems, and what some of the others had was an industry committed to helping the technological buildup so that it was enticing for industries to come. And I was wondering how that is or could in the future work in Hartford.
Yeah, most, not all, but most of those cities you just mentioned have very large research institutions located in the city as well. And that's something we don't have. We have a number of smaller universities and colleges that, when you put them all together, they've got a decent-sized student body, and we're trying to get them more engaged. But we don't have that large research institution headquartered in Hartford. And so, I think the answer, my best answer, maybe it's not, maybe it's not maybe no substitute for that research institution, is what I was talking about before, getting those insurance companies to work together in a very deliberate way to plant a flag and say, no, we're going to be doing our innovation work here. And to join us in recruiting other firms to do the same. So we may not have, a research institution focused on technology, but it's a big deal that Infosys is making Hartford one of its innovation hubs. That's 1,000 jobs that, in tech that also helps to send a signal about what's happening there. You'll have another big blockchain company that just came, announced that it's coming in to West Hartford just down the road. I think you've got to get that sense of momentum that helps to build on itself. But I also believe that at the end of the day, technology firms don't make a city active, vibrant, culturally rich. It's having an active, vibrant, culturally rich city that brings the tech firms because they want to be where the talent wants to be. So that's what I'm focused on. Maybe I'll look back and say I was wrong, but I really believe that the way you got to go about economic development in Hartford and in Connecticut is really focusing intensely on building that place that has the energy that allows it to become an engine of growth.
Andy? Andy, and then...
Andy Calote. You referred a couple of times to financial transactions that you don't approve of, and I wondered if you could describe them a little bit, and also if you had a financial advisor helping you, what the financial advisor...
This is a no soliciting zone here.
We did. As we were...
So he asked first, you wanted to describe the bond transactions that didn't make sense.
Yeah, they were transactions, both of which, particularly the latter, essentially dropped, as I described earlier, dropped what had been sort of a relatively flat $30 million a year debt service down to a couple of years of $10 million debt service to buy $20 million of relief, but then created a mountain of debt service just a couple of years down the road. So I mean, maybe you describe it differently. I would describe it as sort of a classic scoop and toss. And coupled with that was new issuance that really, was probably not supportable at the time.
Financial advisor.
Financial advisor. We worked with Rothschild, and I mean, we didn't do any transactions ourselves, and we didn't end up doing. We were working with a financial advisor and a legal firm in preparation for a possible bankruptcy filing, and we were modeling lots of possibilities of what we would present as part of a plan, but we never actually did a transaction.
And did Rothschild advise you on the dealings with the state about how to structure that, or?
Yes, although there were a lot of questions about how that deal would end up getting done. We thought going into that we would restructure it and the state would make its commitment in the context of that restructuring. What ended up happening is the state made a contractual commitment to take on the debt service and retained the authority to direct a transaction at their discretion.
Hi, I'm John Hunt. I'm at the University of Georgia, but in a previous life, I did a lot of sovereign debt restructuring work. And so one of the things that I was curious about is it seems that there was a desire to, transfer the obligations from the city back up to the state. But in the process, the creditors sort of preserved their principal and capital. And I could understand the desire to bail out the public unions and things like that. But I'm curious about, it would seem that it would have been possible to purchase the distressed debt via a loan from the government of Connecticut, and in some ways do a swap in that direction, which is consistent with sort of some of the sovereign debt buybacks that other countries have done. And I was curious if that had been a thought, and in which case you would have had a much higher, sort of lower level of debt service for both the state and the city combined, or not.
I think that had we gone down the bankruptcy path, there's a decent chance that something like that is what would have come out of it. I think it's awfully hard to do the timing on what you describe right, because to be able to do a transaction that really captures a lot of value, you've got to have a pretty big spread, and that means people have to be really afraid of default. And as soon as the state signals that it's going to come in and help out, the fear of default goes away, and you don't have that spread anymore. So I'm not sure that was achievable outside of Chapter 9. I think it might have, again, I think that might have been exactly what happened in a Chapter 9. And I do kind of wonder, one of the things that I wondered as we've spent a lot of time looking at other Chapter 9s and preparing for it is, at some point, will there start to be some sort of prepackaged Chapter 9s? That really hasn't happened yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if that starts to happen, and that the kind of what you described becomes a common element of those prepackaged deals.
You guys have time, one more? There's one in the back. I'm sorry, I can't see who you are. Can you bring the mic back there? No, we want to use the mic because we're recording this.
Okay, good. Thank you. You mentioned that...
Tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm sorry. Andy Glassberg, University of Missouri, St. Louis, and now a Portland, Maine resident. You mentioned that the opportunity zones might be an interesting possibility out of the current administration, and I'm wondering, given the fact that the tax law is passed, the zones have now been designated, what you see might be an effective role for the city in attempting to get these to be used effectively, whether you think there's any possibility for integrating this with any other state and local economic development incentives. And then finally, once these things are going, how in the world you would look at evaluating their impact given that they're embedded in the tax law rather than in a federal appropriations process?
Yes or no question.
So, does everybody know what opportunity zones are? Can I just assume
No.
that?
No.
No. Okay. So the opportunity zones provision of this law says that states can identify 25 of their high poverty census tracts for designation as an opportunity zone. Once an area has been designated as an opportunity zone, then opportunity funds can make investments in that opportunity zone, and those funds present an opportunity for tax deferred, for deferred treatment of capital gains tax, and then tax preferred treatment of any future gains. So in other words, if you've got capital gains, you can invest in an opportunity fund. You defer all of your capital gains for up to 10 years, I think. And at year 7, if you've kept it in there, then you only have to pay 85 cents on the dollar on your pre-existing capital gains. In addition, any new capital gains are tax-free. So that's part one. In Hartford, 10 of our census tracts were designated as opportunity zones. And I think that the role for cities is to be able to demonstrate to investors why and how their investment is part of something bigger, why they should believe in the future of this city or in this tract, notwithstanding the fact that it is by definition a historically distressed area. And so I think that for one thing, I think there's going to be a significant first mover advantage here. Those mayors that can get out and tell a story that's true about their cities and be able to explain to investors why this investment fits into a broader strategy that has the possibility of really making change in the city and also really delivering a return on their investment. I think are going to have an advantage in that fight for capital. There are 8,700 some odd opportunity zones around the country, so there are going to be a lot of places where this capital can go. On the other hand, there's a few $1 trillion of capital gains sitting out there that could potentially be invested. So I think that's the role for the municipality. Measuring success, I'm not sure I understand why it makes a difference whether it's embedded in the tax code or appropriated. I think the success is going to be measured on whether you attract investment into zones that, again, have historically not received a lot of investment. And I think that opportunity zone, tax preferred treatment can be one more thing that makes a deal workable. In itself, I don't think it's going to do the trick. If it's coupled with, some subsidy, that makes it a little bit better. If it's coupled with a broader redevelopment strategy for that area, that makes it a little bit better. So I think you've got to, try to put as many pieces in place to make each one of those deals work. But I do think the opportunity zones can be a meaningful incentive to bring capital to places it hasn't been going.
Great. So I want you to thank me.
We do thank you.
I want you to thank Mayor Bronin for A, taking the time to come down here and being so interesting, and B, for taking on what is a tough job that most of us wouldn't have ever dreamed of taking on. So please, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.